Well, hello guys, welcome back to the channel and welcome back to the build of the Top Gun F-14. Things are getting really serious now with this aircraft because we're getting into the fun stuff, the actual aircraft portion. So stay tuned and we will get back to this build. All right guys, so far we have done a bunch of detail work. We've painted the landing gear, we have weathered the landing gear, and we've taken the gear, the swing wing mechanism out of this aircraft, and now it's time to start getting things built and assembled. So first order of business for this plane is the fuel tanks. Now we can't put the gear back in, the swing wing mechanism back in until we get these tanks. These are the main saddle tanks, I guess if you want to call them that. The main rear tanks reinstalled. So what we need to do is we need to put our high flow bungs in and let those cure, and then we can get them installed in the fuselage. So let's do tank stuff. All right guys, for the tanks, we're going to be using these DreamWorks high flow fittings. Now, these are made in two different sizes, and the reason we're using the small ones on the saddle tanks or these back tanks is just the size of this area. I'll show you what the other ones are. So the other bungs are these guys right here, so you can see the size difference. Now on these bigger bungs, the benefit is you can fit a bigger clunk through the hole. On these smaller ones, you can still use high flow clunks, but they can't be the big massive things. But anyway, so this is what we ordered for the saddle tanks. We've got the two brass clunks, we've got the smaller bung set up, and then on the main tank, so the front tank, we'll be using these larger ones. So I ordered a mix of both, but these larger ones I was worried that they wouldn't fit in this area. So anyways, that's why we didn't order them. And yeah, they're too tight. Like you can't even get them pushed all the way back in. So anyways, what we're gonna do now is, I think these holes are actually the right size for these guys. So we need to glue those in. So we'll get that done. And then we also need to glue the vent nipples in. Now these vent nipples are going to be pointing forward in the aircraft, right? And so that is probably the area where they're going to be mounted. Maybe we'll go in the middle. I'll have to play with that a little bit and see. The key factor there is where is the best place for them to go in the aircraft for the plumbing. Now the other tank is right here, but this tank, the main tank's vents are going to come to the pickups on the saddle tanks, and these vents are going to go outside the aircraft. So we're probably going to be running that vent closer to the front. So that's going to be the determining factor on where those vents go. All right guys, Nez is here helping like normal. So we're going to put these vents right in the middle of the tank there facing forward. These vents are going to be joined together to one tube. So what I like to do for this drilling of these vents is use a step drill. Okay, I've got this one. This one is pretty much the one I always use for tanks, and we just go to number 3 there. So the one thing that happens with these Kevlar tanks is they fray quite a bit when you're drilling into them. And I find the step bits are kind of one of the best ways to deal with it, but you'll always get that fraying. Okay, so we go to hole number 3. Just check, yes, that's the right size. Don't worry about getting your tank full of little bits. We have to put alcohol in there and clean that out anyways. So what I'll do now is I'm going to take some thin CA, put it on these fibers, and harden those fibers up. And then what I do is run the drill bit through there again, and that helps get rid of those fibers. So we take our thin CA, just soak those fibers up, spray some kicker on it. So you can see that it's kicked off there. The fibers are nice and hard. So now all we do is run that drill bit through again, like that. And we can take our X-Acto knife, cut off this portion. And there we go. So that's a little bit of the secret there to getting a nice clean hole on the Kevlar tanks. That's what I do, and seems to work quite well. If you get into a bigger hole size, it's a little bit more difficult, but for these smaller ones, that works out just fine. So now what happens is the actual vent fitting here, this is a perfect fit where you can just screw it in. So I don't screw these in all the way, because we don't want that vent fitting going down too far in the tank. So what I'll do is I'm going to get the other tank ready, and we'll put some high sol on here, and we just screw this in a couple turns, basically like 2 turns, just like that. And the high sol fills in the gap around the fitting and the tank, and everything is just perfect. So I'm going to get the other tanks prepared, ready to go, and then we'll glue all these fittings in. All right, guys, and the vents can't go in the middle of the tank. And I'll show you why. They need to go towards the inside of the fuselage. So if you look at this bump right here, the middle of the tank or middle of the fuselage right there. So the middle of the tanks sit right on this seam line, and we need to have the vents on the other side of that seam line so we get into this area right here. And I don't think you could run them on the right side of the tank because there's not enough space there. And I've tried it, and if we put the tanks in, we can tuck that vent fitting underneath like that, and it's able to go in that area. So first oops, so not a big deal. What we do in this case is we just sand down this area right here around the hole that we put in. We'll put a little piece of G10 material, a fiberglass material over top of that, glue that in place, and then we need to move our vent to the inside of the tanks, right? So this is the right tank. That's forward in the tank. We need the hole to be right in that corner right there. All right, so we're all ready to glue everything in here. So the bungs, the main bungs here fit fine. I took my Dremel and just got a little bit out of the holes. We have made 2 little G10 plates here to cover our oopsies. And I've sanded one side of the plate, the other side is smooth. And then I've also sanded the area around the hole. I've talked about this before in previous videos, but you want to make sure that you don't go too far. If you go too far, you need to put a little bit of glue or epoxy over top of that little grind mark, because a little grind mark in these Kevlar tanks, you can have air or fuel leaking out. So, so that's what's going to get glued on those little areas right there. So we're going to mix up some high sol. In this case, we're using 9462, which is the long cure stuff. Best solution for this option. And I'll get all these fittings glued in, and I'll show you guys the results. All right, guys, and there we are. I really love these DreamWorks high flow fittings. They've got a little groove on the back side. So all I do is I just put epoxy or high sol on the back side of this. When you push it into the hole, you'll see those dots come through. It's just perfect. So I don't touch those glue joints at all. It's just awesome the way it is. So that worked out good. Obviously we've got our vent fittings, just took my finger and cleaned up around it. And then we've got our little coverings for the oopsies. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put a little bit of weight on top of those guys just for a bit of pressure. But the tanks are good to go. We'll let those cure, then we're going to clean them out, and then we'll get the clunk lines and everything set up. We do have to pre-plumb these tanks before we put them in place. So our vent lines, we need to have some of our 8mm Festo coming off of those vents before we put them in place. Otherwise, you're never going to have access to them. All right, guys, so all the tank bungs and everything has cured. It's the next day. So now we're gonna start putting this tank together. So what we're gonna do in these tanks is we're gonna have clunk lines. We're gonna put a little section of rigid tubing in here, and reason for that is with this tank shape, we really don't want that clunk to fold back over because it's not a big tank and there's not a lot of room for that clunk to correct itself. So we're going to basically have the bung fitting, a little section of Viton tubing and a rigid piece, and then we'll have just a little section where the clunk is. Now the reason we're going to use Viton in here is these are buried in the aircraft. We never want to have to pull these things out because you got to disassemble all the swing wing stuff and pull the gear out. So that would be an absolute nightmare. So we want to make these so 10 years from now, these tanks are still operating perfectly. So I'm going to get the clunk line set up here and I'll show you guys what the result is. Okay guys, so we've got some of our parts together here. We've got the tanks ready to go and set up the clunk lines. What we're going to do first is we need to rinse these tanks out. So we're going to put some 99% alcohol in there. We're going to use 1 bottle on each tank and basically dump it in there, swish it around, dump the rest of the bottle in there, swish it around, and that gets rid of all the little fine particles and everything inside the tank. So let's do that, and we can get into making the clunk setup for these tanks. All right, guys, so a couple things here that I'll mention about tanks. So number one, the stock clunks obviously won't fit through the opening, the bung openings. And these are also lower flow clunk lines. And these are the stock tubes that come with the tank setup as well too. So anytime, in my opinion, you're using anything above a 160, you want to go with a high flow setup. So this is the larger diameter tubing that we're going to use on the inside of the tank. You can see the difference in there. So the stock tubing actually fits inside, the outside diameter fits inside this other piece of tube. So we're going to use that for our middle tube inside the tanks, and then we're using one of the BVM high flow pickups as well too, and these are just a way larger setup. So all this stuff has large fuel tubings, so it's all easy to assemble. So I'll get these things put together. All right, so the clunk lines are made up here. One of the important things when you're using saddle tanks like this is you want to make sure that everything here is identical. So you want your length to be identical, you want your tubes and everything to be as identical as possible, and that evens out fuel flow as the main tank sucks from the 2 saddle tanks. So anyways, we're going to get these installed, and then we can pressure test these tanks and check to see if there's any leaks. And I feel like a bit of a broken record sometimes because I talk about this information in every single video, but when you thread these in, don't use Loctite on here. And what I do is take a little bit of shock oil, just silicone lube, and put it on the O-ring, and that helps to seal everything up. And that is all you need in this situation. Okay, so we're ready to test these tanks out and check them for leaks. Now you can do this a couple different ways. You can never use a compressor to put air in these tanks, you'll destroy them. What you can do is, if you have time, you blow in a tube like this with your mouth. The other openings have to be closed off. And what I do is just cinch this down with a pair of forceps, leave it overnight. The next morning, if you come back and release the forceps and air comes out, then obviously it's holding pressure. The other thing you can do is submerge this underwater, blow in the tube with your mouth. Again, just pressure from your mouth, and check if there's any leaks. When you let go of the pressure, if you put alcohol in there, be careful because the clunk will pick up the alcohol and shoot it back in your mouth. So just keep that in mind. Anyways, we're going to go pressure test these tanks in water. All right, so tanks passed with flying colors, no issues at all. So what we need to do now is we need to get plumbing installed on these tanks. So what's going to happen is the main tank sits right in front here. So main tank sits right there. We're basically plumbing it pretty much as per the diagram. So you fill up the main tank through the pickup lines, it fills up, it comes out the vent line, and those vent lines go to the pickups on the saddle tanks. The saddle tanks fill up, and these go to a vent line outside the fuselage. So what we need to do is we just need to plan for, and these tanks are backwards right now, but plan for these tanks to come together into a single Festo T, and then that's going to go forward into a vent fitting outside the fuselage. So we need to get some 8mm Festo tubing mounted on the vents, and then we need to get some 8mm Festo tubing mounted on the pickups, and those pickups, or that needs to be long enough to come forward to the vent lines. So just the initial planning here, so we want to get those tubes attached before we actually put it inside the aircraft. All right, guys, and these are those moments where I will spend a ton of time planning out silly little things like the vent fitting. So tanks go in like this inside the fuselage. These vents are going to come to a T and needs to go to this vent fitting. Now, there's no room back here for the vent. There's no room where the main tank is, and I want to try and keep that back part of the front portion of the fuselage completely open so we've got lots of room to mount stuff. If I did put it in the front of the fuselage, that vent line would come here somehow and right down to this area. So don't want to do that. So what I'm thinking about, and the owner of this aircraft, David, he starts his aircraft on this side of the plane. So what I'm thinking about is putting the vent right in this area right there. Now the benefit to doing that is we've got a decent amount of space in the fuselage when that 8mm Festo line comes off to bend, because I was thinking about putting it in here, but the problem is that it's a little bit too tight in this area to get the fuel tubing to bend like that. But this area is nice and strong, nothing's going to be in the way, and I think that's going to work out good. So pretty much settled on mounting our vent right here. Okay guys, so I've got the first tank installed here. So I did a couple things. Put a long piece of 8mm Festo on the bung lines. And also what I did is I hooked up the vent line to a 8mm Festo T. So the line coming off the bottom of the T there is the line that's going to go to the vent. And I hooked all that up to the left tank just because for me, I think it's going to be easier just to install this other line on this side. So that's the reason I did that. But obviously we can't have those all hooked up and get them installed because there's this big thing in the way. So I also put the swing wing mechanism in here just to make sure we'd have no interference. But next thing I'm going to do here is get the right tank installed, and then I've got to get this line hooked up to that Festo T, and I think this will work out good. So our vent fitting is all hooked up there. The T is right in the middle of your screen, and I needed another set of hands to do this, so my daughter gave me a hand because that was quite a challenge to get hooked up, but it is hooked up. So that's going to work out very, very well. So far I'm happy with the results on that. The lines are obviously well hidden and everything. So what we're going to do now is we're going to bolt this tank in place and bolt the other tank in place, and then I may get the vent mounted at this point because we've got a lot of excess line just hanging off here. Right there, so it'd be nice to get that all finalized, the vent line put in place, and then we can start working on getting the gear and the swing wing back in. And just as a refresher, those tanks, they basically have hardware back here, and they just bolt right through the former work right there, and fairly simple mounting, so ultra easy. All right guys, so we've got the gear back in both sides. Now, if you're building one of these things, the gear, getting it out is quite a challenge. So when you get the gear in and out, you basically have to have the gear in a retracted position, kind of have to get the gear in place and extend it as you get the bars into place. So it's a bit of a pain, but trust me, it does work. So the gear is loose. Now we're getting the swing wing mechanism ready for reassembly. So what I'm doing here is I'm just going through and Loctiting all of the fasteners on the side that we did not take apart. And then we'll get this inserted in the plane and put the other side back together. All right, so we got the right side reinstalled, everything put back together. This was the side that had this part all taken off. So that's been reinstalled. Now I haven't bolted this to the main beam here of the gear yet. What I need to do is I need to get the gear installed on the other side. Once that's done, then we will we'll bolt this all together and everything. So let's do the other side. All right, and I'm glad I spent some time playing around with this, because what I'm going to do with my vents is I'm actually going to put them right up at the top corner here versus on top of the tank. Now they're going to work out a lot better sitting in this location. The top of this tank is really, really tight. So basically the lines going back to the saddle tank bungs can go right there and plug into those vent lines. So glad I spent some time working that out. And that, yeah, that's awesome. Really happy with that. So we do have to enlarge these holes on this tank and put the new clunk lines in there as well too. But that tank was basically installed just so we can get everything mocked up properly. Now what I'm going to do is run the vent line outside the fuselage. We do have everything done on the swing wing mechanism. So it's all installed. The kit does include these two little G10 things. And those are just spacers to go underneath the swing wing against the tank. If you don't put those in, there can be a little bit of play there up and down with the tank, because we're fixed at the back end, not the front end, right? So I just put those in there, put some CA along the joint there where the material contacts the tank. So that's done. The last thing we have to do here is run the airlines, but we're going to do the fuel system first, and then we'll deal with these airlines. So the other part of this, when I'm putting these vent fittings in, especially on these scale kits, the bodies are very, very delicate. So what I'll do now is I'll cut a small square of 1/8" ply, put that same hole size in here, and that'll go on the back side of this vent fitting with some high sol on the back side, and that just helps strengthen that whole location. So you don't get any the vent fitting pulling through or damage the fuselage. So I'm going to get this thing set up, and then what I'll probably do is I'm going to glue the tank fittings at the same time for the main tank, because we've got all that all the details for that sorted out. All right, so we've got the tank all ready to go with the large bung fittings. Now these are substantially larger than the other ones. And love these things. Look how big that thing is. So you can fit one of the huge clunks in there if you need to. So with the vent fittings being so close together, obviously they can't both thread in. So one of these I sized to thread in. The other one I oversized it just a little bit so we can kind of, you know, force it in place there, and that'll work fine. So tank is ready to go. We've cleaned out as much of the debris as possible while the tank is wide open like that. Also with the vent, again, we're just getting all this stuff ready for gluing. All right, so the vent is all installed. That went just like it should have, and we're all good there. And we've got the fittings glued in the tank, so we need to just let these sit until tomorrow before we do anything with that. So we'll treat this tank the same as the other ones. We will clean it out with alcohol, pressure test it, all that kind of stuff. But that needs to sit till tomorrow. Okay, so the next thing we need to do, guys, is run the lines back to the gear. So we've got these groupings of lines here, which are gear and brake lines, and also air brake lines for the back. Now those we're not doing anything with. Those just get set off to the side. And these are our gear and brake lines. So pretty straightforward. This is a fairly complicated routing on this gear, but I did take a bunch of pictures beforehand. But it's pretty straightforward. You basically have these 3 here, which go down to the gear. This one goes around the back and goes to the actual air cylinder that moves the gear up and down. And then these 2 go to the locking cylinder on the linkage arm down there. So pretty simple, but what I'll do is I'll get this all done on one leg, and then I'll show you guys how it's all routed. All right, so I'll just give you guys a bit of an overview and some shots here of how things are run. So I put 3 airline keepers here. These are my own 3D printed ones that are available on my website, so we put those there. Also changed the lines going out to the gear lock to these white lines, because those ones come down the gear and connect to this cylinder right there. So we don't really want any bright red and blue lines just hanging out there. So just a nice little scale effect just to help make it look and blend in properly. Now the brake line kind of comes down the back side. And that's one of the downsides with these F14 gear, is because the linkages are on the leading edge. There's really no good way to route this. All right, guys, finally wrapped up with this one leg. So I will show you exactly how we routed everything as best as possible here. So I'll just give you the shot as we drop this gear down. And I'll give you some pictures here, or some video. So we've got our 2 white leads coming down right on the front side of the actuating cylinder. And that just comes right against the nub where the cylinder sits against. Our brake line comes down on the back, right through there. So there's again some shots. And you can see down there how we've got everything routed for the lock cylinder. So as I talked about in the previous clip, we went with white line there, just so it would be as hidden as possible. I may switch this zip tie out to an opaque one, like that right there, and maybe it'll hide it a little bit better. So I'm gonna think about this a bit more and see if we can figure out a better solution. But originally, the brake line came straight down here and right to the wheel. So what I did this time was come down here around the front, and I did toy with the idea of running it through right here, but when this all closes, it does run the risk of pinching the line and maybe cutting through the line there. So anyways, I ran it on the outside right here, down behind the dog bones here, or the linkages, and then through that section right there. And then we come down into the brake cylinder. So hopefully that gives you a good idea of what we're doing here. And then when we go up with this gear, everything is good with it. The only thing with this zip tie right here is you can't have anything excess protruding on the fuselage side of that linkage here, because it's going to hit the fuselage. The tolerances are very tight for this area, so just keep that in mind. So this gear's done. Basically, we just need to repeat the exact same thing on the other side. All right, guys, and I think this is a great time in the video to thank all of you that have donated to the Shop Build Fund. I know I say this in every single video, but thank you very much. I appreciate the donations, and it makes a world of difference on how the shop is going to get built, the awesome things we can do with it. So thank you for those donations. I do really appreciate it. All right, so we got the tank all sealed off this morning, and I filled this thing with air so we can check and see if it's holding pressure. And I think we're still good. Now when you release this Tygon tubing, if you've had it clamped for a while, it sometimes will stay sealed. There we go. So it released itself and we still had pressure in here, and it's about 12 hours later. So anyways, front tank is good. I did not do the plumbing setup yet for this tank, so we're gonna get that done. And the clunk lines is what I'm talking about. So we're gonna get those done, and this tank will be ready to install. All right, so for main tank, we're doing exactly the same thing as the saddles. So I have these large high flow clunks, which we'll be using. These are the same ones we used on the saddles. We're going to have a piece of rigid tubing in the middle, and then we're going to have the fuel bung sitting over there, and will be something roughly in that kind of length there. So basically just straight clunks. Again, we do this so it doesn't fold back over itself. All right, guys, and the main tank is complete. The nice thing about this tank, I don't know if it'll show up on camera, but there's these two little channels in the bottom here, so the clunks naturally sit in those little grooves in the bottom. So yeah, it's a nice setup. I like this tank setup. It's a good shape, even though it's just a tank. So we had a successful video. We covered a lot of different things on the F-14. Obviously getting the tanks reinstalled, plumbed, getting the swing wing mechanism back in, getting the gear back in, or the main gear, the nose gear hasn't been installed yet. So lots of great progress with this aircraft. Probably won't do the front landing gear until we're ready to bolt the nose together, or at least I'm gonna give it a little bit more time on the front gear, and we're gonna start focusing on the back portion of this aircraft. So the next things that I'm gonna be working on is going to be the elevators and rudders. So that's probably gonna be the pure focus of the next video, is just gonna be the elevators and rudders, because these elevators are very similar to the F-18 elevators or horizontal stabs. It should be a fairly simple process, very similar to the F-18, although we are using an MKS servo, so a little bit of a different setup there. But the rudders are going to be the big challenge on this aircraft, because there's a few different ways to do them. So that's going to be the topic of the next video. So thanks guys for watching. If you haven't done so already, don't forget to give the video a thumbs up, one of these things. And if you haven't done so already, I don't know why you're not doing it, but hit that subscribe button down below. It's free to do so. When you do hit the subscribe button, hit the bell so you get notified when I release new videos. That's it, guys, for this video. Thanks for watching, and we will see you next time.